Hello, good morning. So this is an interesting situation that we are in, and this is nice to interact with all of you through this new media in this new classroom. So this lecture that I'm going to deliver today is going to talk about research methodology. Now for all of you who are either doing a communication research methods class, or if you are even preparing for your dissertation. So even in your dissertation, you are going to have a chapter which you are going to call as methodology. So what I'm going to talk to you or discuss with you today is going to help you in structuring that particular chapter. When you are writing your dissertation, what exactly goes into that chapter which is called the methodology chapter? How are you going to organize that chapter? Even otherwise, whenever you are writing a synopsis, you are writing a research proposal, there also you are supposed to talk about this research methodology chapter. You have to outline the specific techniques and tools that you are going to use for the research that you are planning to conduct. So I'm going to talk to you about how this chapter is supposed to be structured. What all goes into that particular chapter called research methodology. Now when we are doing our research, we know that how do you arrive at that research methodology chapter? First, you have provided your theoretical framework, you have written your introduction, the theoretical framework, the conceptual framework. You have also provided a rationale for doing that particular study. That means you have identified a particular gap in the available knowledge, and you are now proposing to conduct a research and contribute knowledge towards filling up that gap in that existing body of knowledge with regard to any particular subject. So we are dealing here with communication studies. So you have already written a reason as to why your particular research is important. Your rationale you have completed. And then you come to what is the research methodology chapter. That's where you're going to tell that yes, my research is important and this is how I'm going to conduct my research. So for explaining to you as to how we write that particular chapter, I'm going to create, or I'm going to try and relate it with something probably which all of you enjoy, and that's food. So we can think of the research methodology chapter like a recipe for a particular dish that you are planning to prepare, and your entire research is probably that dish. So you are now providing the recipe for that to someone who doesn't know anything about your research or who doesn't know how to cook at all. So that's the perspective with which you should start probably doing or writing your research methodology. So let us see. We are trying to say that the research methodology chapter is like the recipe for food. So what all do we need to say when we are planning to write the recipe? First, what you need to say is, what is this dish about? That's the first question that comes to your mind, that whether it's a veg or a non-veg dish, right? You need to inform that. If you have informed about whether it's a veg and a non-veg dish, then the question comes, where is that cuisine from? Like it's continental, it's Indian, it's Chinese. Further, you also need to say that whether it's part of the main course or it's snacks. What are you preparing today? So these are certain very basic things that needs to be very clear to a person when you are telling that person about your research methodology as well. So when that first thing, that what it is, it's a veg or a non-veg dish, it's a Indian or a continental dish. Even if it's Indian, it's North Indian, South Indian, you need to specify all of that, because that's going to tell you what is going to be your ingredients. So once I know that, yes, I'm interested in this particular research or not, I'm interested in this particular recipe or not, how do I get to understand that? I get to understand it that, yes, now I am interested in breakfast. Oh, this is a breakfast item. This is a continental breakfast item. So that's what I'm supposed to expect out of it. You won't have curry leaves in a continental breakfast item. So it makes me mentally prepared to look at certain things for ahead when you are telling me about your research methodology. Now, before I get into that, it's also important to understand that when we are talking about research methodology, we have to understand one distinction, which is the distinction between these two terms. Distinction between methods and methodology. Methods are the various techniques through which we do research. These are the general techniques which are there. Like, you have content analysis, you have rhetorical analysis, you have case study. So there are certain specific techniques which are there. So when you are talking or learning in detail about those, that is what is called methods. But when you are talking about methodology, that is something which is very specific to the specific research that you are doing. That means here you are going to appropriate and justify everything for that specific research that you are doing. Hence, we name the chapter as research methodology because it is specific to that particular research that which you are doing, whereas methods are the generic techniques through which research is done. These are the universal techniques. And when these universal techniques are appropriated, that becomes the methodology for your research. So we understand the distinction between these two terms, which is methods and methodology. Now, coming back to the starting point of the recipe, where you are trying to tell people that what type of a dish it is. Veg, non-veg, continental, breakfast, dinner item, main course item, what it is. So that bit of it, where you tell or inform about the basics of your research, that's called the research design. So that's your first heading for your research methodology chapter, where you are talking about the research design. That means you are telling what is the genre of your research. What is the type of research that you are going to do? That means here you are going to explain or you are going to state that your research is an exploratory research, your research is a descriptive research, it's an analytical study, it's an evaluation study. What is it? What is the type of research that you are doing? Next, you have to state that it's a qualitative study. What's your approach? It's a qualitative or a quantitative approach. So that's the basic thing which you need to state as part of your research design. The type of research that you are planning to do and the broad methodology that you are adopting. So that means you are doing a survey research, you are doing a case study research, you are doing maybe ethnographic research. Okay, so these can be the different types of research. So you explain that yours is, first of all, you explain the type of research in terms of the objective of the research, the purpose of your research. That means whether it is explanatory, exploratory, descriptive, correlational. So what is the objective of your research? Next, you are going to state about the approach that you are using. That means whether you are using a qualitative or quantitative approach, and then you are going to state the exact means that you are using for your research. That means it's an ethnography, it's a survey, or it's a content analysis, it's a case study. So what is that research you are going to do? So all of that you are going to explain as part of your research design. So that's the first bit which comes as part of your research methodology chapter. After you have explained this, I'd suggest that you go on to the second point, which is stating the aim and the objectives of your research. Now, some people also put the aim and objectives as part of the introductory chapter or immediately following the rationale. So it can also be there, but I'd suggest, as far your dissertation is concerned, I believe it would be better placed here in the research methodology chapter, following the research design. Now, why here? Because everything that you're going to state out here is going to be drawn from the aim and the objectives. So, and you might also have research questions, and you might also have hypothesis. Now, I'm sure you understand the differences between research questions and research hypothesis. When you are doing an experimental research or a correlational research, that's when you would have a hypothesis. If it is more of a descriptive research, you would have only research questions. So there are distinctions between research questions and research hypothesis. Not all research would have a hypothesis. There are some research which will need to have an hypothesis. I believe you are also aware about the inductive logic and the deductive logic of research. And so when we have a deductive logic, we would usually have an hypothesis. When you have an inductive logic, you will you may not have an hypothesis. You would mostly have an hypothesis if you are doing a quantitative research. In qualitative research, you may not have an hypothesis. So there are various questions and situations with which we decide whether to have a research question or research hypothesis, but obviously each and every research is going to have aim and objectives. And we have already discussed in detail with regard to how to frame the aim, how to write the aim, and how the aim, the broad aim, should lead to the specific objectives. How the objectives become the steps through which you achieve the aim. Okay? So that's about the aim and objectives, the research question and hypothesis. That's what follows. Next, then the third point. What you have is your sampling design. You might also want to call it data collection design. There might be some research which will not employ sampling. In many cases, qualitative research or case study research will not have sampling, simply because in a case study you have only one sample. That's your case. Okay? So you will not have a sampling design. If you are doing ethnographic research, you may not have a sampling design. So then we will go ahead with a data collection design. Again, to go back to our corollary of a recipe and this. Now you have told what it is about. You have said that it's a breakfast, it's a dinner, or it's a, what sort of a cuisine it is. And after that, you need to tell me that what are going to be the ingredients. Okay, what are the ingredients? That's the next thing that you need to talk about in a recipe. So what are the ingredients and how am I going to select my ingredients? So basically, my ingredients are the sources. So the sources are from where I'm going to get my data. That's what I'm going to analyze. That's what I'm going to deal with. So the sources are basically my ingredients. And the sources, how I have selected my sources is basically my sampling design. Okay? So if my sources are basically my ingredients, that means like what are the vegetables or the other ingredients which goes into that particular curry. So I'll have to mention my sources. I believe you understand that there are two different types of sources, the primary and the secondary sources. So I'll have to specify what are my primary and my secondary sources. Primary sources are the sources from where I have empirically collected my own data. They are my primary sources. And then the sources which are already available, like government reports or data. So those are the secondary sources. So primary and secondary sources. So I need to state which are my sources, and I'm going to state which are my primary sources and which are my secondary sources. So once I've stated the sources, I will be continuing with my sampling design, and I'm going to tell that how I have done my sampling, what has been the technique of my sampling. That means how did I select each of my sources. So whether I went for a probability or a non-probability sampling. Okay, so and I believe you already have understood what are the different types of sampling, the probability and the non-probability sampling. Then that's what I'm going to state here. I'm going to state the sources, and then I'm going to state how I have selected each one of these sources. So I'm going to state that I'm going to put in these sort of ingredients, and then I'm going to also justify as to why those are the ingredients which are the most appropriate for the curry that I'm preparing. So that's one very important thing when I'm stating each of these, is that constant process of justification. So in the research design, I have to justify, because as I told to you, the difference between method and methodology, that your methodology is appropriate for your research. So every time you have to justify that why is this research design the most appropriate research design for your research. Similarly, you have to justify as to why this sampling is the most appropriate sampling technique for your research. Why these primary sources are the most relevant primary sources of data for your research. So you have to every time give a justification for the sampling techniques that you have selected. You have to provide justification for the sources of data that you have identified for your research. That process of providing justification is extremely important. Next comes the tools of data collection. The tools of data collection. So you have to now specify, you need to cook your recipe in the microwave oven, or you need the gas stove, or you need what type of spoon is required. So all the different tools. You're cutting, you need the knife or you need the grinder. So all the different tools through which you are going to process the data that how are you going to collect the sources from the sources? What tools are you going to use to collect the data from the sources? That means what tools are you going to use to process the vegetables or the ingredients? What tools are required to process the ingredients? Remember our example of the recipe? So you have stated here what type of cuisine it is. You have stated what ingredients it is and how you have selected those ingredients. And now you have to tell or inform as to how those ingredients needs to be processed, the tools which you have used in order to collect the data from the sources. So the tools of data collection. So what are the different tools of data collection? Obviously, we are aware of the different tools of data collection, like you can have observation, you can have interview, you can have questionnaire, you can have focus group discussion, you can have schedules, you can have telephonic interview, you can have face-to-face interview, you can have in-depth interview, different types of interview. So those are your tools of data collection, the tools that you use to collect your data. Collect the information which is relevant for your research. So you have to identify what are the different tools of data collection. So you might have a mixture of multiple tools. So that means for some group of people, you might have done interviews. For some group of other sources, you might have done a focus group discussion. You might have done a in-depth interview in another case. So if there are multiple sources, and those multiple sources require multiple tools of data collection, you would identify what are those multiple tools of data collection. And remember, every time you need to provide a justification as to why you have used a particular tool of data collection for a particular source. So if you have used a focus group discussion for doctors, so you've made a few doctors sit and discuss on a particular topic. So you'll have to tell that why is focus group discussion the most appropriate tool for data collection in that particular situation when you are planning to collect the data from the doctors, and why it was not something else. Why it is the most appropriate means. So that justification needs to be provided every time. If you have done interviews, you have to state as to why that is the most appropriate means of data collection. So the tools of data collection is something that you need to specify. And after that comes the fifth point, which is the data analysis design. You have collected your data. Your recipe is complete. You have done your cooking with your tools. Okay, you have executed the tools in the field. Now comes the data analysis. That means churning everything together. Okay, getting the final output from there. That's data analysis. So that means you are going to talk about here that you had all the data. How are you going to segregate it? How are you going to organize that data? How are you going to correlate that data? How are you going to analyze that data? How are you going to extract what you need out of all the data that you have collected from multiple sources of information? So that's what you state in your data analysis design. You might have coding, you might have tabulation. There are multiple ways that you do your data analysis. You can also have statistical analysis. Okay, there are multiple tests of correlation, tests of significance. So there are different tests, statistical tests which you can do as part of your data analysis. You can simply do percentile analysis. So mostly in case of an MA dissertation that you are planning to do, you would probably be doing a percentile analysis of the data that you have collected. In qualitative research, if you are doing that, then you would probably have some coding, you would have some tabulation, you will organize your data in a particular manner and then analyze it. So that's what you need to state at last, your data analysis design. That how do you plan to analyze the data that you have collected? So these are the most essential things that you write as part of your research methodology chapter. I'll just go through a quick recap again. The research design, where you first of all state whether it is explanatory, descriptive, what type of research you're going to talk about, whether it is qualitative or quantitative. Then you are going to state whether it is a case study, whether it's a survey, and then you are also supposed to give a definition of each of these methodologies. That's what you write in your research design, along with this justification for selecting that. You write your aim and objectives, research questions or hypothesis. I would want to write a or out here, so you do not have both. Research questions and hypothesis, both are not there. So either research questions or hypothesis. You write your sampling design or data collection design. If you are not doing sampling, then your data collection design, where you identify your sources, you state which are your sources, you state the primary sources of data, you state the secondary sources of data, you write about the tools of data collection, explain each one of the tools and provide justification for each one of the tools, and then you write about your data analysis design as to how you are going to analyze the data. So that's your research methodology chapter. Please call me for any clarification that you might require, and in our next lecture we'll discuss little bit about the different tools of data collection. Okay, thank you.